During President Barack Obama's State of the Union address, a call to raise the minimum wage. We'll discuss raising low-income Americans from poverty and how a rise in the minimum wage could be a jobs killer on West Michigan Week.
In the coming weeks, I will issue an executive order requiring federal contractors to pay their federally funded employees a fair wage of at least $10.10 an hour, because if you cook our troops' meals or wash their dishes, you should not have to live in poverty.
And that was the president Tuesday night during the State of the Union address. Here are panels to discuss it all. Carol Valade, Grand Rapids Business Journal. Good to see you. Zane McMillan, MLive Media Group, Grand Rapids Press.
Thanks for having me.
You look like prom dates.
Yes, right.
As a matter of fact, we are.
You forgot the corsage.
Yeah.
And our guest is Janet Lathrop. She's with the Michigan League for Public Policy. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
And Jarrett Skorup. He's with the Mackinac Center for Public Policy.
Thanks for having me.
Some of us watched the State of the Union. Some of us didn't. I would imagine you both did. You know the line. So, Janet, you are for raising the minimum wage. You agree with the president.
Exactly. Well, I think that increasing his executive order, possible executive order to increase it to $10.10 an hour, is obviously going to only affect a small portion of workers right now. But it is a step in the right direction, and it really does move the conversation forward on the benefits of increasing the minimum wage.
So it sets a tone for a broader increase in minimum wage, and you oppose that.
Sure. Well, you know, I oppose minimum wage in general. It's bad public policy, but of course it is good politics. A lot of people tend to like minimum wage and the idea, but it's a political move. It's something that's going to be popular this year. It is an election year, and the fact that the president called for it this year during an election year should help tell you it's a political move, because if it was good public policy, it could have been done in years past. So that's at least part of the reason.
Who are the individuals earning minimum wage? Is that not primarily younger, maybe teen workers, more than, you know, and at what percentage of the population? Maybe 2% are actually earning minimum wage?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how that calculates to be a deal breaker one way or another economically.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the exact population that makes minimum wage, it's a very small part, 2 to 3% of the workforce. Most of those younger Americans, people who are starting out on their first job, which is also one of the reasons why it's really hard in terms of the economic literature on this. You know, there's a lot of studies showing that it costs jobs. There's other studies saying it doesn't matter as much, and a lot of that reason, you know, people that pay attention to the media, that's what you see, and the reason is because it's such a small group of people, really limited sector of society.
Actually, I would have to disagree. Actually, 1 in 4 private sector workers would benefit from the increase in the minimum wage. And they are not really teenagers, to answer one of your questions. In Michigan, about 85% of workers who would benefit from an increase to the minimum wage are actually adults over 20 years old. And the average age is actually 35 years old. And there are more 55-year-old workers earning these wages than there are teenagers. So the demographics are changing for the minimum wage. If they were teenagers in the past, they are not at this point.
Are these, do you know how that splits out in terms of 55-year-olds who might be on minimum wage? Is that a pre-retirement type of position?
I do not know that,
okay.
But I do know that there are more of them than teenagers.
Are those related to the most recent census, 2010?
It is based on the census, yes.
Okay.
Census information.
I mean, and it also depends, you know, kind of what we're talking about. That doesn't mean that that's the percent that are necessarily making minimum wage. Saying they benefit from it, well, if you call for hiking it to $10 an hour, that's anyone making between the minimum wage now and hiking it to that $10 an hour. Now, of course, if you said, I want to hike it to $30 an hour, that would help a lot bigger part of society, because a lot of workers make less than $30 an hour. Now, I'd take issue with that a little bit, because it, of course, could harm lots of people, which would be the people who lose their jobs if government mandates, you know, a higher wage hike. But, you know, there's a study the other year using census data and Bureau of Labor Statistics. Only about 10%, actually 11% of people who would gain from that increase up to the $9.50 are people who live in poor households. So you have a lot of people who are making minimum wage, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're poor. They could be a second income earner for a household. They could be a young person that's in college. You know, of course, there's a lot of college students who are in their 20s that are making minimum wage, but that doesn't mean they're poor necessarily. They could be from a family who's, you know, middle income.
And from Yannette, you did provide us
Yes.
from your Center for Public Policy the benefits of an increase. We have a graphic here. Full-time jobs created would be about 4,600. The average annual wage increase per affected worker, $2,256 annually. Total wage increase, and that would be all affected workers, of $1.7 billion, and an overall boost to the economy, the Michigan economy, of $1 billion. So I guess, of course, the metrics here, where did you arrive at these figures?
Those are estimates that were census-based and based on other information. They come from the Economic Policy Institute. That was the basis of our estimates, but we changed it to reflect Michigan realities. So EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, is the think tank that was able to come up with a lot of these figures. They did the basic research.
And that's the hike. What would the hike be? The minimum wage hike to what amount for that?
That would be to 1010. That
Okay.
would be to the federal proposal. Yes.
Well, they should call for 20 because that would double the amount of jobs and income going back.
No
into
one
society.
is calling for an increase to $20 an hour. And you know, we gotta be careful. And I know that I am a vocal advocate of increasing the wage. But we got to be careful about how much we ask for as far as an increase, because we could come up with, difficulties if we increase it to double what it is now, for example. That might not be as responsible of an approach to increasing the wage. So at this point, as far as I know, nobody at the federal level is proposing a hike over 1010 right now. And at the state level, the proposals have been to $9 and $10 an hour. So it's very, very modest proposal. And the $2,200 annual increase for these workers is actually very modest, is unlikely to lead to inflation. And I know that's one of the worries. So again, $20 an hour is not really anything. Nobody's calling for that type of increase right now.
Going back to one of Carol's questions earlier, if there's a smaller portion of the population, if there's a small percentage that makes minimum wage or would benefit from this, what's the harm in doing it? You know, I think she was trying to get at that earlier.
Sure, yeah. I mean, because it's a small portion, the harm's going to be less, you know, so it's only going to affect the people making under that amount. But there still is going to be harm. I mean, what we're talking about, yeah, so if you hike from 7 to 9 rather than 7 to 15, which some groups are, in fact, calling for, which we've had protests around the state talking about that, well, the harm would be much greater. Now, the point I'm making is you're always going to have an effect. Any public policy that you put in, there's positives and negatives, and the idea is you want the positives to be greater than the negatives. Now, I'm saying that, you know, if you're a small mom and pop shop, if you own an ice cream store and you're hiring teenagers in the summer and you're paying $7.50 an hour and you're hiking to 9 or 10, that's a 25% increase in what you're paying people. Well, that's a pretty big effect for those local groups. But along with that question, there's lots of groups that pay higher than a minimum wage already that would be less likely to be affected, a lot of larger corporations, of course. And so what you're going to do is you're going to affect a lot of the smaller groups that cannot, where the wages are a higher portion of their payroll, and they're the ones that are going to have trouble adjusting to this.
Is there any talk to kind of make a tiered system, like based on employment numbers for the different businesses? Has there been any talk of that, or is that too complicated?
Not that I've
No.
seen.
Yeah, I haven't heard that. But responding to Jared's discussion of the effect on small businesses, actually, the majority of small businesses are already in favor of increasing the minimum wage and indexing it to inflation. 1. 2 is that a lot of them are already paying above the federal minimum wage.
Inflation is much lower than the 1010 proposed.
What's that?
Inflation rate would be much lower than the 1010 that's been proposed.
Well, I would disagree with that. I mean, if they're not in favor of the raising the minimum wage, because they could very easily do that for their own employees.
Right.
They
anytime.
already are, yes.
Right, and so if they are paying above that amount, then what they're asking for is to make their competitors pay more, which of course gives them a
Exactly.
competitive advantage.
Well-
they don't need the government to do it. They can go ahead and do it if that's
Well,
what they feel
it would
they
be good to mandate big box stores, for example, like Walmart, who are paying very small wages to their workers. to pay a minimum wage, this would actually level the playing field.
I mean,
So
Walmart
that-
pays
that-
$10
so
to
that-
$13 an hour, and their CEO has called for a higher minimum wage hike. But that is not
That
because
was back in 2005. They have not come out in favor of the minimum wage this time.
Generally speaking, from the employer community, those who do employ at minimum wage don't see those particular jobs as career tracks. They're meant, most often there's a lot of turnover. They are positions that, assist, a company in one way or another. And so if you're attempting to affect wage rates and bring that level a little farther than it has been measured in the last 10 or 20 years, isn't it more discussion about education and education funding and making sure that those provisions are there so that people are not tracking in that minimum wage for a lifetime?
That would definitely be ideal. In Michigan, we really need more money going into the public school systems for sure. But we don't have to choose between one or the other. We could have both. And I think that would be good public policy to, again, increase the minimum wage so that the erosion of the wage over time is made up by that increase. We're talking about a $7.40 an hour wage that right now, or in 2013 actually, was worth $7.25. If we don't increase this wage, by 2022, we're going to be looking at a much smaller amount. And that amount actually would be, do I have that in here somewhere?
Well, I mean, what I'd say, like, that kind of gets to part of the key of the question, which is we understand, people innately kind of understand, people are paid based on supply and demand. Government cannot just set a wage with no harmful consequences. That's why, if it was just employees got to pay whatever they want, every single person here would make minimum wage. I assume MLive doesn't pay everyone minimum wage. And the reason for that isn't because MLive is just a more generous employer than McDonald's is or a local ice cream store. Maybe they are. But that's not the reason. They have to pay more in order to get people in there to hire them to do it. Minimum wage jobs, they tend to be starting out jobs. They're people, obviously there's a lot of turnover on them. And one of the harmful effects of raising it is you make those jobs less likely to happen. So, everybody starts out somewhere, and government can certainly make it harder for people to come out and get that start.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, more on the minimum wage debate in just 1 minute. And we're back with more West Michigan Week. We are discussing minimum wage, and the president announcing this week that he'd like to see a minimum wage of $10.10. It would seem across the board at some point. It is a political year, as you mentioned. But is this really about getting people, raising them out of poverty, and in some ways getting more money circulating in the economy? I mean, how much of that is a part of just raising minimum wage just a little bit to help people out and then to put more money in the coffers of government and business and everywhere else?
Well, that is one of the benefits of increasing the minimum wage is the injection of money into the economy. It's, again, a moderate amount per worker. By that increase over time would lead to benefits such as the $1 billion over 3 years that we estimate in an economic boost to the state. But that injection of money, again, as you mentioned, it keeps money circulating in the economy. It doesn't sit in somebody's bank account necessarily, because these are wages that are earned by workers who don't have a lot of money, who are likely to go and spend it out on the basics, and maybe once in a while in a luxury. But this is money that will be in the economy. This is money that is going to be bringing in more businesses for many shops out there. So it's a very, very good public policy to increase this minimum wage.
Well, I mean, on the other hand, you can decrease the money floating around in that standpoint if people lose their jobs. which is one of the consequences of a minimum wage. And unfortunately, the people, if a business does not believe, let's say they want to hike it to $10.10 an hour, if they don't believe you're worth that amount, it doesn't matter what the government says, what anyone says, they're not going to hire you. If they think you're worth $8 an hour and the government forces them to do 10, they're going to lay that person off. Now, that means the people who are getting laid off tend to be the lowest skilled. They tend to be the low-income people. So you're harming the people that the executive you are trying to help. Now, you want people to come in, start at a job at whatever the level is, and work their way up. We never talk about this in the sense of, say, unpaid internships, which, by the way, virtually every congressman who voted for this higher minimum wage has unpaid internships. So they're mandating that other businesses have to pay these high amounts when they're not doing it on their own. And their defense, of course, is, well, this person's getting in, they're learning skills, and they're working out their way up and out. Well, that's exactly what happens with lots of jobs that people start out in.
And you also make your case using the minimum wage and jobless rates in Western Europe. We have a graphic here where we take a look at the countries with a minimum wage, and there are quite a few here. They're in alphabetical order, but you see the minimum wages on the left, the jobless rates are on the right, and then we move ahead to those countries that have no minimum wage, and you can look at those jobless rates as well. What do you see here from this data?
This is a chart from Mark Perry, who's a professor at University of Michigan, Flint. And now this is a very, this is not to totally imply correlation implies causation or anything like that. There's a lot of really complicated factors in lots of countries, and there's other things. But the point of it is, just because you have no minimum wage, it's not that we're going to go back to child labor or something like that. There's lots of countries that have no minimum wage, half of Western Europe, as you can see, and it does not automatically mean wages are just driven down to zero. They function very well as an economy.
Again, that goes back to the supply and demand. In terms of those jobs that are most needed in the economy at any one time. And so that doesn't provide, a smooth surface to move forward and make projections. So again, I guess those education rates have to come up to make all of this work.
Sure, yeah, but education doesn't always necessarily just mean schooling. You can get an education by starting out in some business.
A lot of support from the business community too, where they're willing to look at inflation rate as a bar to move up on minimum wage, but not a mandated 10-10, which is considered pretty high and would have that impact on jobs. So is that maybe a good compromise?
The compromise would be increase in education?
Depending on inflation.
Inflation, rate of inflation.
An increase that, even to the rate of inflation right now, would be a step in the right direction, that's for sure.
You think they're going to go there, Phil?
Well, if you adjust it from the original federal minimum wage to inflation, it'd be $4 an hour, of course. But, the point on it is you can't change supply and demand, no matter what you do. And if a business agrees that someone's worth more, they're going to pay them more. And if they think they're worth less, they'll...
I want to pick on the $4 an hour thing. That's only $8,000 a year. Do you really think that anybody can live on that amount?
No, but that's not, they don't just pay minimum wage. That's not how wages are set, in the economy, or else everybody would make that amount.
But you lower the wage floor to $4 an hour so that we can keep up with inflation based on 1938, and you really are looking at wages that are going to be depressed. You lower the wage floor and you say it's too bad if you were earning $7 an hour and 40 cents today. Tomorrow you're likely going to end up closer to that $4 an hour. Lowering or just getting rid of a wage floor it doesn't prevent wages from going down. And that is actually one of the reasons to having a minimum wage to begin with at the federal level. One of the purposes was to impose a wage floor so that a smaller number of employers who were paying lower wages. This is what Congress found when they were actually discussing the federal the Fair Labor Standards Act back in 1938, 1937, was that a small number of employers were paying substandard wages and lowering the wages of the workforce in their respective industries. And the reason to having a minimum wage was exactly that, to make sure that there's a wage floor so that those employers we're really not driving down wages for everyone in their industries, and inducing a lot of poverty in among those workers.
The United States was the richest country in the world decades before we ever had any minimum wage, and the reason for that is not because you had all these people that were just paying money out of the goodness of their heart. It's because people were getting better educated, working in jobs where that's what they needed to pay in order to keep them. If every business could pay just as little as possible, then nobody would make more than minimum wage, and of course people do. So I'm just saying that if we acknowledge and understand that wages are set by supply and demand in the marketplace, when government interferes, it causes more harm than good.
Kind of, people tend to go towards Walmart, like we brought up Walmart earlier, and McDonald's, say, as places that sit on just huge profit margins, and they still say they can't afford to increase. But I mean, are people missing something when they argue that, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, the profit margins are different than profit. McDonald's does not have very high profit margins in terms of if you're talking about the amount they make. It's lower than chocolate companies and things like that, which we don't go after.
That's my fault.
Right. Yeah. So, but the issue is, I mean, if McDonald's thinks somebody's worth a higher amount, they'll pay it. If not, they won't. And if you say you have to pay $10 or $15 an hour, then you're going to lose low-income people, or you're going to see more machines introduced into an area, or you see other factors that are going to happen. But McDonald's does not just wake up and say, I've always been able to pay these people, and yes, all of a sudden now they're worth that amount to me. That tends to not be what happens.
Machines are already being introduced. If it's going to help the profits of companies, they're going to use whatever is available as far as technology to increase those profits. We're talking about companies whose existence, their basis of existence is to make profits, is to make money for their shareholders. So, the mechanization of some of the labor is already happening, whether or not we touch the minimum wage. So, increasing the minimum wage is not necessarily going to lead to increased technological introductions in the workplace.
Mechanization is happening, but you can speed it up.
But you gotta also understand, though, that there are only a certain amount of tasks that can be done by machines. You're still gonna need human beings, and as far as I can tell, Walmart, with their very low wages and their profits, right now are not just firing everyone and getting some robots to man the cash registers. They still have some workers.
Are these jobs that cannot be taken then offshore? Are these jobs that
they tend to
would
be, yes.
not leave
Yes.
the country? And
It
again,
would be
we're talking about that. It's basically 2%.
Well, it would be difficult to, have your drive-through from, I don't know, across the
we can
ocean.
call that in from
But there's other ways you can affect it. I mean, right now Walmart offers health care to their full-time employees. Well, if you say you have to pay this amount, and they can cut into their health care benefits by not offering it. I mean, there's lots of ways.
Another mandate.
Right. I mean, mandates are going to drive up prices, or they're going to distort incentives some way. Now, you can say that's good or bad, but they do happen no matter how you want to slice it. And so there's different things that they can do, make employees pay for their uniforms, things like that, and that's what companies do.
How much of this is about the growing trouble with wealth disparity in this country? I mean, how much of that is driving this discussion right now?
A lot of it's probably driving the discussion. Now, there's not really even left-leaning economists. I mean, there's some, of course, you can find for anything, but even they. I mean, a minimum wage is not gonna help with that problem. That's a very complicated issue, far beyond this issue. In one way, it would actually hurt it, because if you're saying you want to mandate this raise hike and you lose jobs out of that, well, that's going to expand your wealth disparity for people who have jobs and people who don't have them. But Yannette maybe has a different opinion on it.
I heard her sharp intake of breath.
Well, my opinion is that yes, there is an increasing gap in the an increased.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. There's actually a piece on the New York Times from late last year that found that about the top 10% of earners in the country took about half of the country's total income. So yes, there is that. How is the minimum wage necessarily going to affect that? It is, again, a step in the right direction, and there are other things that can be done to lift people out of poverty. And the EITC, for example, is one way to do so. And yes, education, having a better skilled workforce would be one of the ways that we could try to help some families out of poverty. That's one of the things. But, increasing the minimum wage is a step in the right direction. It's not a step in the wrong direction, in my opinion, anyway.
Do you see $10.10 across the board? Do you see that happening?
I mean, I don't think it'll happen at the federal level, but yeah, there's a push in the state, and just the other day they announced a ballot proposal. So this is something that could be on the ballot here in Michigan, and so we'll see what happens. It's certainly an issue for the next year.
Well, I definitely hope so. Yes.
All right. Carol Valade, Grand Rapids Business Journal. Thanks for stopping by. Zane McMillan, Grand Rapids Press. Be safe tonight, you kids.
We will. Got my dad's car.
I want my croissant.
Janet Lathrop, Michigan League Public Policy, and Jarrett Skorup, Mackinac Center for Public Policy. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next week on West Michigan Week.